Guys, check this out. 8 reasons why tanks are struggling to remain relevant on the modern battlefield. And this one from 2020, why is the British Army disbanding tanks? The Marines want to get rid of their tanks. Here's why. And if you Google, are tanks obsolete in modern warfare? You get 500,000 results. If everyone says it, it has to be true, right? Hi and welcome to History Legends. Today we'll take a look at the 7 biggest myths of the Ukraine war in terms of military operations and warfare in general. Today, no foreplay, let's jump right in. Number 1, the tank is outdated on the battlefield. Whether completely destroyed, damaged, or simply abandoned on the battlefield, many analysts started to claim that tanks were now obsolete. This 2022 conclusion is exactly the same one that analysts made in the 1970s, when people were already predicting the end of tanks. Why? Because of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, where Israel lost 100 tanks on the first day alone. And over the course of the war, 1,000 would be destroyed or damaged within 3 weeks. And let's be honest, the Israelis were probably pretty salty that their tanks were bested by Egyptian infantrymen equipped with relatively easy to use and inexpensive anti-tank missiles. But if tanks were so useless, why did Ukraine expressly ask for more tanks? Hundreds of them! Common knowledge is that in urban and forest areas, tanks are like sitting ducks, as mobile teams of infantrymen can fire missiles from any building or foxhole and relocate quickly to move to another firing position. And despite the expensive modern defense systems of tanks, the scale is tipped towards cheaper countermeasures like anti-tank missiles and drones. But now before you sell all your tank stocks, there are multiple things to consider. ATGM crews cannot attack enemy positions. This is not battlefield. You can't simply run around the map with your RPG on the shoulder waiting for a tank to show up. ATGMs are by nature a defensive weapon, and drones cannot hold their ground. How can you effectively support infantrymen to attack and hold enemy positions? What is the alternative? Like Military History Visualized said, what can move at 60 kilometers per hour and fire a 105mm shell 1 kilometer away while shrugging off machine gun and autocannon rounds? The US Army even came to the conclusion that tanks are essential to capture enemy cities, because doing so without tanks would be so time-consuming, costly in manpower, if not impossible. Tanks can protect infantrymen from small arms fire and quickly eliminate enemy strongholds with a direct shot. Sending tanks on their own is suicide, but so is sending infantry on its own. It's actually a combination of both that is extremely efficient, since they mutually support each other. Infantrymen scout for enemy ATGM crews, and tanks can immediately eliminate enemy strongholds. In the end, it revolves around doctrine and training. Maybe it's the end of the MBT, but not necessarily of tanks. Number 2, the Bayraktar TB2 is an invincible weapon. The Bayraktar drones are strangely similar to kebabs. They're Turkish, cheap, and are excellent after a night out. Hold on. Turkish, cheap, and is a quick fix. I couldn't come up with anything better, so you come up with number 3. The Bayraktar TB2 became extremely famous during the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war, with all the footage of its deadly attacks against Armenian vehicles. The year before, it played an important role in Libya, and this reputation kept increasing in Ukraine. Ukraine military had taken advantage of the fact that Russia did not control all the airspace and that it did not have persistent electronic warfare defenses. On top of that, the TB2 is extremely cheap compared to other UCAVs on the market. One TB2 costs about $2 million per unit on average, compared to $32 million for one MQ-9 Reaper. Some say it's the Toyota Corolla of drones. It's not your favorite sports car, but it will do 90% of the job. Did I mention it's cheap? It's proven, practical, easy to operate, easy to maintain, and expendable. You don't see them. You don't hear them. You know they're there when the vehicle in front of you in the column spontaneously combusts. The Bayraktar TB2 is also good for intelligence gathering, recon, and fire support for ground artillery. Nagorno-Karabakh, fighting PKK, Libya, there's a pattern there. Bayraktars are extremely efficient against enemy forces with little to no air defense. Allegedly, by the time of this video, all Bayraktar drones that Ukraine had at the beginning of the war were destroyed. We're talking about 20 or 30. Why? Because the Russians had air defense. These unmanned aerial vehicles proved to be easy targets when Russian radars were updated and calibrated to detect such flying objects. The main problem is its small payload, 150 kilograms of explosive, compared to 1,300 kilograms for the Reaper. Poor maneuverability, low power, about 100 HP, and a relatively low speed at 200 kilometers per hour. So it cannot really escape from an air defense system missile. Because of its low cost, it has a simple structure. And I've read that it doesn't have any sensors that can tell if it's being tracked by enemy radars or if they're incoming anti-aircraft missiles. It doesn't look like it on pictures, but the Bayraktar TB2 is a relatively large object, equivalent to a light manned fighter aircraft. Apparently, it glows on radar like a Christmas tree, and the way it's built increases the radar reflective surface of the TB2. Mainly the trunk and the rear of the UAV. Now, by any means, I'm not saying it's completely useless. It's just not the decisive factor. However, it is important to mention that if combat UAVs had their limitations, the use of tactical drones as a tool for forward observers to recon enemy positions and adjust artillery fire proved to be essential for warfare. Before we move on to number 3, a quick word from today's sponsor, Surfshark. Have you ever been followed by someone everywhere you go? Sitting right behind you in the car or in the bus, right behind you at work or at school, always looking over your shoulder, and even breathing down your neck at the gym. This is what your internet provider does to you, and in some cases, the government. When you go online, you're constantly monitored. Everything you do is being logged and tracked. Even if you open the incognito window, I know you. That's why you should always be keeping your internet activity private by using a VPN like Surfshark. Surfshark secures your data with top-of-the-line, uncrackable encryption. And on top of that, Surfshark intentionally does not keep logs of what you do. With Surfshark, you can easily access and unblock streaming platforms and get different content libraries from around the world. Simply pick a server, connect, and you'll be good to stream. So you're completely safe with them. Click the link in the description below and use the code HistoryLegends. And with just one Surfshark account, you can connect as many devices as you want. For yourself, your wife, your girlfriend, many devices. Okay, look Habibi, Surfshark has a special deal just for you. That includes 83% off of a 2-year plan, plus 3 extra months for free, plus a free antivirus. You can't do better than that. You can protect yourself for just $221 a month. I'm telling you guys, always use protection. All you got to do to secure this amazing deal is click the link in the description below and use the promo code HistoryLegends. Number 3, Battalion Tactical Groups is the best military structure. We all remember before the war how all the media was hyping up the BTG like no tomorrow. As if every battalion tactical group had an Iron Man in it. That's actually not a bad movie idea. The reason for all this hype is simple. Mobility and immense firepower. Each BTG normally had approximately 60 to 80 officers and soldiers, 10 tanks, and 40 infantry fighting vehicles. And if that wasn't enough, boom! It had 18 tracked howitzers, comparatively 6 times more artillery than an entire American brigade combat team. What's unknown to most is that BTGs were first introduced in Ukraine in 2014, and they were quite successful in the battles of Ilovaisk and Debaltsev. The entire thinking of the Battalion Tactical Group was an armored component supported by pro-Russian militiamen from Donetsk and Luhansk. Overall, it meant that BTGs could evolve in relatively friendly territory where they could rely on unsecure communications like mobile phones to communicate. But that bit them in a bunda in 2022. Apparently now they use Signal and it's much safer, but I don't know. Jokes aside, the structure that made the BTG so successful was also the root of its failure. Most of it was already brilliantly outlined by US Army Captain Nicolas Fiore in a 2017 paper. The main problem was that among the 700 personnel, only 200 were infantrymen, separated in squads of only 5 to 10 men. If in Donbass, they could be beefed up by Donetsk and Luhansk foot soldiers, but in the forests of northern Ukraine, they were completely on their own. Basically, the BTG would penetrate dozens of kilometers into enemy lines, but the lack of foot soldiers meant that it wouldn't be strong enough to storm urban settlements. They would always have to resort to bypassing strong points and push further. That's how they progressed really fast in the first days, but that also led to a logistical nightmare. The infantry squads were so small that a handful of casualties were enough to effectively destroy the unit, and that made BTG commanders risk averse. Communications then got intercepted, supply trucks then got ambushed along the way, which further weakened the combat capability of the BTG. Captain Fiore actually managed to write a guide on how to defeat the Battalion Tactical Group, using data from battles in 2014 and 2015 where Ukrainian forces actually defeated BTGs. The first step was to endure the BTG's bombardment and fix in place the battalion's few regular infantry squads, then counterattack around and wreak havoc. And this effect is multiplied in urban and forest areas. The lack of infantrymen meant that small Ukrainian teams armed with ATGMs could approach their target and fire almost at point blank. So the BTG is not the future superstructure. Since then, the Russians have abandoned their BTG experiment. They went back to a more natural structure by beefing up infantry strength to storm urban settlements. Similar to World War I, it's more like infantry supported by armored vehicles. They also avoid pushing deep into Ukrainian lines, as they prefer to always have friendly units on both flanks, and always making sure that the rear is always mopped up. For example, using special forces. If there was artillery in every BTG, now they removed that and centralized artillery at the brigade level for better coordination, because they lack proper communication systems. Essentially a structure similar to the American Brigade Combat Team. Number 4, special forces will turn the tide of the war. Hollywood loves special forces. 13 Hours, 12 Strong, Zero Dark 30, Lone Survivor, American Sniper. Hollywood loves special forces. But not only them, video games like Call of Duty are all about small teams of elite super soldiers with specific jobs and skill sets that will have a huge impact on the battlefield, as they're each worth dozens and dozens of enemy fighters, if not hundreds. Worst is, there is some truth to it, and it's always because of them that they win the war. Like in Lone Survivor, where 4 Navy SEALs face off 200 enemies, when in reality they were followed by 20 guys. But let's be honest, special forces are known for their extreme selection process. On top of that, they're often the first ones sent overseas straight into enemy territory. They're the big guns the people depend on in the toughest situations. All special forces share two things. They're mobile and lightweight. But that also means small units with no heavy weapons. In the modern era, mobility comes in the shape of helicopters, goes hand in hand with special forces, and that allows them to be deployed fast and anywhere. They were extremely useful in the past 20-30 years in special operations against a diverse set of guerrillas and insurgents all over Africa and in the Middle East. But this mobility is their Achilles heel. Believe it or not, but helicopters are very fragile. They can suffer greatly even from sustained fire from PKMs and AKs. Missions are often aborted just because of that. But again, using helicopters means that they always need to resort to surprise and make sure the enemy has no air defense. Otherwise, shit hits the fan. Lately, I saw a lot of footage of Russian special forces, the Spetsnaz, clearing out forests here and there. But is this really what they trained for? Problem is, in conventional war, more often than not, commanders don't know what to do with them, and sadly often resort to using them as regular infantry, even if this is not their job. And this is not ideal because they lack robustness and have a hard time replacing casualties. That's not a new phenomenon. During World War II, Americans deployed a certain number of elite special forces units, like the 2nd Rangers Battalion. Their mission revolved around long-range raids, hit-and-run tactics, demolition, camouflage, and small unit attacks on entrenchments. They're the ones that scaled the cliff at Pointe du Hoc on D-Day. But after that, what do you do with Rangers? You know how it goes. They were used as regular infantry. During the Battle of the Bulge, they were sent to Hill 400 to plug the gap. And the commander of the 2nd Rangers complained to headquarters that this was a misuse of his Rangers. Because of their stealthiness, they managed to capture the hill by surprise and make 28 German prisoners, and suffering very light losses. Almost immediately after, they were hit by a storm of steel and 2 German counterattacks. By late afternoon, only 25 Rangers were still on that hill. The battalion was effectively annihilated. In real life, on the front line, everyone knows that special operation forces are good soldiers, but that's it. Most of the stuff that special ops soldiers are training for isn't really needed in everyday combat situations, as all special operations share some common limitations. And because of these limitations, special forces and SOF can only achieve tactical success here and there. But if your battle plan sucks, with thousands of soldiers to manage, no special ops team in the world will be able to save you. Number 5. Close air support dominates the battlefield. Right after special forces, it's not an American war movie if air support doesn't save the day every single time. Since the Vietnam War, and especially in the past 20 years, air support has been omnipresent to fight guerrilla groups. In such wars, enemy units are very mobile, and only aviation could target them wherever they went. And the fighter jet is extremely accurate. A fighter jet's 500-pound bomb has 192 pounds of explosive, when a 155mm HE shell has 24 pounds of explosive. So just imagine the damage it can do. A moving pickup truck filled with insurgents is an impossible target for indirect fire like artillery, but it can easily be picked off by an aircraft. What if it's a supply convoy filled with weapons, driving 200 kilometers from the closest ground unit or firebase? Once again, this works fine when insurgents or the opponents have little air support. Even in Vietnam, air support suffered heavy losses. Now imagine in a conventional war like in Ukraine. The Russians do have air defense, and some argue that they have some of the most modern equipment, and in huge numbers. Remember, at the beginning of the war, Ukraine wanted a lot of fighter jets, but then they quickly shifted to heavy weapons, and that included a lot of artillery. And this came to as a shock to many when artillery, the king of battle, made such a comeback. First and foremost, there's the cost effectiveness of artillery. For the price of one F-35, you can buy 150 M777 howitzers or 50 self-propelled Paladins. On top of that, if that wasn't enough, flying the F-35 costs $36,000 per hour. Then there's all the maintenance, all the skilled technicians. And that's not all, it takes years to train a proper fighter jet pilot, when you can properly train a crew for a self-propelled gun in 2 months, while a towed gun crew could be trained in 2 to 3 weeks. I didn't pay attention about it at the beginning, but that was the main hint, that these howitzers were meant to be used directly on the front line and not for a Western army that could attack somewhere in the late summer. It was for now. And second, there's volume. A self-propelled howitzer, which costs a fraction of what an attack aircraft costs, can lob a 100-pound shell 30 kilometers downrange every minute all day long. And this is exactly what the Russians are doing. For that single SPH, we're talking about 72 tons of ammunition. That's twice a full load for a B-52 heavy bomber. And that volume allows you to pin down enemy forces as well. Now imagine the effects of hundreds of such artillery pounding your positions. Allegedly, the Russians have a 10 or 15 to 1 advantage in artillery pieces on the Ukrainians. According to the Ukraine side, they suffered between 500 and 1,000 casualties per day, 80% caused by Russian artillery. Disclaimer, some sources claim that the Russians fly 300 sorties a day, which is huge, but that is not the driving factor of the battle in eastern Ukraine. Here, Washington Post. Russia is firing as many as 50,000 artillery rounds a day into Ukraine positions, and the Ukrainians can only hit back with around 5,000 to 6,000 rounds a day. It's also important to mention that in a conventional war, ammunition gets used up extremely fast. Not only do you need to produce the rounds, but you also need solid logistics to bring it all to the front. The United States had committed to deliver 220,000 rounds of ammunition. That's enough for 1 month of battle. And these 220,000 rounds is what the Russians use up in 4 days. Many NATO armies considered artillery to be obsolete. And because of this over-reliance on air support, many countries have extremely low stockpiles of artillery shells, like France, for example. That is said to have used up most of its stockpiles against the Islamic State, as they fired 5,500 artillery shells in 5 months. Number 6. Tactics over strategy. We all know that one player who's the best at dribbling the ball, pulling off the craziest tricks, but a couple trick shots alone won't win the game. After 20 years of deployment, NATO armies got a lot of battle experience, and they taught everything they knew to the Ukrainian armed forces, to the point where the Ukrainians became really good at small unit tactics. By small unit tactics, we mean, for example, Ukrainian soldiers learn how to move and maneuver fire teams, squads, platoons in attack or in defense from instructors that fought all over the world. For example, during an assault, they'll teach infantrymen how to advance under the cover of suppressive fire of nearby supporting units. They will stress that one soldier must always be firing at the enemy while the others maneuvering. The men will advance in bounds towards enemy positions when they'll use grenades and automatic weapons to engage the enemy. As a result, on a tactical level, Ukrainian units were extremely efficient. The first problem of these teaching this experience is that once again it came from fighting guerrilla warfare. Nobody expected that a conventional war would knock on Europe's door. Everyone believed that this era was over and that they would only fight abroad. In turn, we can summarize it as small unit tactics with heavy firepower against lightly armed insurgents. The same way professional British soldiers witnessed the lethality of firepower in 1914 after decades of experience fighting insurgencies. Now, I feel that NATO personnel couldn't actually teach Ukrainians what to do if they were outgunned. When your artillery is not responding, when your artillery has just been blown up, while you're getting hammered by hundreds of artillery shells that pin down all your ATGM crews. And then you have thermobaric warheads. And then you have incoming battle tanks coming towards you, supported by hundreds of well-equipped infantrymen, and no special forces can come to the rescue. In other words, the bigger the scale of the battle, the less important are small unit tactics. The Germans learned the lesson the hard way during World War II. The second problem is that small unit tactics stop working when a large percentage of the well-trained professional unit leaders and soldiers are killed, wounded, or captured. The replacements won't be capable of replicating these complex maneuvers, and the unit will quickly fall back to the basics. In the end, despite super fancy urban and forest warfare tactics, both sides realize that you still need a lot of infantry to make offensives work. The third problem is getting lost in details and forgetting about the bigger picture. In Iraq, Afghanistan, and in the Sahel, NATO commanders became very good at combined arms fighting, but usually lost the knowledge on how to maneuver large forces. And they simply handed over this package to the Ukrainians. The largest operations in Iraq and Afghanistan usually involved helicopters, armored vehicles from multiple units, sometimes tanks, artillery, and so on. But usually less than 500 soldiers moving in a sector at one time. Maybe I'm exaggerating, maybe it's a bit more. But it came to the point where you could have a general micromanaging the operations of a battalion on the map. Now, what do you do when you have 100 battalions to coordinate? What do you do when all your 100 battalions are engaged simultaneously? By trying to fiddle too much with tactics, that's how you get encircled and outmaneuvered. And number 7, the future belongs to compact professional armies. A compact, professional military is an incredibly powerful, flexible force that can deploy rapidly. This is the model that most NATO countries have adopted. This combination of training and modern equipment made a deadly duo, allowing the army to develop specialized units trained for different scenarios, maximizes their chances of success while minimizing losses of both personnel and material. And they do a tremendous job at small-scale operations anywhere in the world. However, as we have seen in the past couple months in Ukraine, in a conventional war, both sides suffer high casualties at a very fast rate. And ideally, these losses have to be replaced by equally good troops. Let's take a look at the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war. Azerbaijan claims to have lost 2,906 military fatalities and 11,110 wounded for a total of 14,000 casualties. That's 25% of their standing army gone within a couple weeks. And again, that's according to their estimates. According to Zelensky and his advisors, they claim that in Donbass, Ukrainian armed forces are losing about 800 killed and wounded per day. Every 24 hours, within a month, we're talking about at least 24,000 losses. That's more than the size of the professional soldiers of the Canadian ground forces, gone within a month. At this rate, within 3 months, it's the German army that's done. Question is, how do you find well-trained replacements and fast? Unlike military equipment, you can't buy it from abroad. Although you could, but that's the topic for another video. We can imagine the standing army like first responders. In a prolonged conflict, casualties will inevitably increase, and you will require immediate replacements. And preferably not only guys that can shoot and reload, but also all sorts of specialists, technicians, and officers, which take a lot more time to train properly. Armed forces need a strong reserve component, which has to be ready by the time of the war, or it's a bit too late. Reservists can either be former military members who reach the end of their enlistment, but it should also allow civilians to undertake basic and specialized training in parallel with regular forces while retaining their civilian roles. Just take a look at the Ukrainian armed forces. Before the war, they had a strength of about 200,000 men. Because of the attrition, after 3 months, we can estimate their losses at 50% of that number. The only reason they can still fight today is because they have a huge reserve component that could immediately intervene and plug the gaps. And even then, it's difficult. So imagine if this reserve was non-existent. It's the first time I do something like that, so let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. Also, let me know if I forgot any myth. Might do a second video for that. As always, if you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you like my work and want to support me, make sure to check out my Patreon or my PayPal. The link is in the description.